Good evening. My name is Eric Kirk. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. And Dave is taking a break this week. He and I have with me Dr. Aaron Donaldson. I believe he's been on the show, was on the show a couple of weeks ago talking with Dave. We have a lot to talk about tonight. We're going to start with the end of a 20-year war, the longest war in our history, beating out Vietnam, I think, by some months. I forget how much. We've come a long way. Of course, it was a very chaotic ending, a lot of screaming and blaming going on. I did read an interesting article today that I'd like to kind of discuss the nuances of, is that apparently the cooperation that Joe Biden referenced between the Taliban and the military was very real, that the Taliban was actually directing people. Actually, when the intelligence reported that there might be a bomb on a particular bus, the Taliban emptied the bus, then reloaded them. I mean, a lot of real interesting stuff going on here. Not to suggest that the Taliban are, great bunch of people necessarily, but certainly pragmatic. They definitely wanted a smooth transition out, and them coming into power, they've got a lot of problems, I suppose, that they're going to have to sort out, including there actually is a province they haven't taken yet. There's some fighting going on there. A lot to talk about. And then coming back home, the Democrats are kind of quiet on this. The media just went on a frenzy over the past couple of weeks, and Republicans are playing right into it. They are on the attack, hoping that this could bring down or cripple Biden's political capital. They are relentless on it. Biden is basically saying this was the best we could do under the circumstances. Gave a speech to that effect. A lot going on with that, and we'll see where the media takes it over the next few days. The media has finally broke a few stories talking about how the long history of this, that essentially we've spent 20 years propping up what appears to have been a complete illusion that just melted away overnight. Aaron, what is your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you kind of are hitting on it right there for me. Like, it was a foregone conclusion before we began to pull out that the Taliban was going to resume their governorship, if we can call it that, of Afghanistan. And I think that considering that they were in power when we arrived, and that was pretty much a big part of our reason for invading in the first place, it shows how drastic of a failure that war has been, to the point that, we really make no qualms about the fact that we're like negotiating with the very people that we invaded 20 years ago to try to topple. We displaced millions of people. We've wasted billions, trillions of dollars in this effort. We have absolutely destroyed the credibility, if there was any, of the United States military, and created just incredible grief and suffering for the people of Afghanistan, to say nothing of American veterans. I think that one big mistake that I wanted to really speak to, that I'm seeing in the way that this is being talked about, is the way that people are talking about an end to the war in Afghanistan. Right. If we don't have to go too far back, but on 2001, we started two wars at the same time, and both of them were under the onus of a so-called war on terror, which absolutely continues. And while Joe Biden did, quote the numbers that we've all been hearing for quite a while, $300 million a day for 20 years being spent in Afghanistan, and saying that there's more we can do with that money, it's not coming out of the 52 cents per dollar of discretionary spending that we're given to the military. The war on terror is absolutely going to continue. We are still using drone strikes in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Somalia, in Iran, and absolutely in Afghanistan. I think we can expect this to continue. Our defense contractors are definitely going to continue to stay there, as will our, counterintelligence and intelligence folks that are stationed there. So I think it's interesting. We're withdrawing the remaining, military personnel we had, handing power directly over to the people that we were claiming that we were invading to topple, and doing nothing in terms of recouping the costs of this war that could be spent on better things. Heaven knows there's better places to be spending that money right now than on defense, but that does not seem to be in the cards. So it's hard to say it's ending.
Well, and it's, of course, the original impetus for us attacking was apparently 9/11. We were going in, to take out Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and basically what we did was chased them into Pakistan. And people are talking about, oh, they're going to come back into Afghanistan. I don't know why they would do that. They seem to have a pretty cushy, refuge in Pakistan. I mean, that's where Bin Laden, when Bin Laden was killed, he was like in the vicinity of a lot of Pakistani military people. There's no way they didn't know he was there. So I don't know that it's going to make any difference in terms of that. Why would they go back into a war zone when they've got a pretty cush, thing in Pakistan? But we certainly aren't going to bomb Pakistan. They're a nuclear power now. It's anyway, there's a lot of hypocrisy going around. I mean, as we've discussed on previous shows, George Bush, in his campaign against Gore in 2000, pledged, "I will not nation build," and we ended up nation building in two countries at least. Anyway, it is a long term. I mean, and I feel real bad, especially for the women who've come to rely on troops to protect them as they're being educated. Is this a new generation of Taliban? Are they any better? Are they any more pragmatic or more realistic? I don't know. It seems like at the very best that we could expect, it would be a Saudi Arabian type government, but I don't think we're even going to get that. But even that's really bad for women. So, it would be a reversal from that. In terms of, the impact on domestic politics, I mean, the Republicans are going to attack. Democrats are running scared, largely because the media it's just completely went overboard on this. Very few people in the media. I think on NPR I've heard one person who said we should have been out of there a long time ago. Ironically, I'm hearing actually a few conservative voices saying that. They're saying, yeah, it's a good thing that he's leaving. But you have this basic media that is centered around all of this military industrial complex guys in Washington, and they just they attack Biden not just for how he was doing it, but we shouldn't be ending this war. They thought he would reverse what Trump did, apparently. And I'm actually not a big fan of Biden in a lot of ways, but this was the right decision to make. And I do think in the long run, that will probably show to be the case. I think the Republicans might be making a mistake here, because I think if you get outside of the Beltway, there are people who might be horrified by the images that they saw, but they'll be over that in a month or two. What they are going to know is that we're not in that country anymore, at least, with a full on occupation. You're right, we're going to continue drone strikes. But in fact, we even did a couple while the evacuation was happening. Interestingly enough, the Taliban didn't even complain about the first strike, but because it was striking their enemy, I guess. The second time apparently killed some civilians, at least according to reports, and they were a little bit more indignant about that. But we'll see. But this was a disaster that was 20 years in the making. We should have left. If there was justification for invading against Al Qaeda to get Al Qaeda out, we should have left the minute that happened, and a long time ago. And I question whether or not that was even a wise thing. Maybe take a lesson from Israel on how we deal with people.
Yeah, I think that the media has certainly turned to the cheerleaders of the original invasion, which again is fascinating considering how little we've accomplished in the time, to justify it. There's absolutely no denying that leaving is the right choice and that we have overstayed our welcome and failed. Democracy Now! Hosted Phyllis Bennis, who's the fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's author of a book called Before and After U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terrorism. She points out that in the 20 years that we fought this war, several million people have been created as refugees, and we've only taken in 20,000 in this country. Germany has taken in several several 100,000. Iran has taken in several 100,000. The media is showing very dramatic images of refugees right now. Republicans are claiming to speak for refugees and against the Taliban, but Donald Trump released 5,000 Taliban prisoners in January of 2020 and got nothing. Got some very, very useless peace talks that went absolutely nowhere, and it's hard to imagine that those 5,000 people aren't like part of what we're seeing going on right now, like making it worse, exacerbating the problem. America did not care about Afghanistan when we got involved. We were there in order to drum up the economy, in order to secure our military interests abroad under the guise of fighting terrorism. We have not achieved any of other strategic objectives. This is pretty much the gameplay top to bottom for our country.
All right, we're going to move on to the next topic. I just want to point out the Republicans who are, shedding crock tears for the refugees are now outraged that so many of them are coming here. Anyway, we'll talk about that. That takes us to the next segment.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
All right. For those of you who haven't been paying attention, Roe v. Wade was essentially overturned. It was done subtly, maybe in a way that won't hurt Republicans too much because it's kind of a quiet way of doing. But Texas basically passed a very draconian law that basically it passes the heartbeat law, which is basically 6 weeks for most pregnancies. A lot of women don't even know they're pregnant in that amount of time. So by the time they learn they're pregnant, it's already too late to make that choice. A lot of other draconians are like bounties they're talking about for turning people in and the rest. It's a very scary law, and basically it was upheld at the appellate court, and the Supreme Court didn't have to issue a decision in favor of that law. They just had to not hear it, and it's not a precedent as a matter of law, but it's a de facto precedent. Now other states are going to do this. Roe v. Wade, of course, is a federal protection that prohibits states through the 14th Amendment from imposing too many regulations on choice. And they talked about how each term in Roe v. Wade, maybe the third term would warrant a little bit more regulation than the first term, but this goes way into the first term, and it really is scary in terms of the precedent. Probably won't have an impact in California per se, because California has privacy explicitly written into our Constitution, passed in 1972, with the explicit understanding that included the right to choice. But and probably a number of states it won't affect either. But there are a slew of states who, for women who might have to leave the states to get an abortion, and there might even be laws against that. So, we'll see how that goes. But this is the way they're doing it. They're chipping away at Roe v. Wade. But essentially, for a lot of practical purposes, Roe v. Wade died at midnight when they let that law pass.
Yeah, everyone's talking about the shadow docket or the shadow schedule of the court, which is kind of like the pocket veto when the president doesn't decide to, sign a law and therefore it doesn't get passed. Here, the Supreme Court has decided not to hear something that many people felt deserved a very, very direct hearing. And I think that what's really, really fascinating about this bill, as far as I'm concerned, Senate Bill 8, as it's called, is that it was very explicitly and very transparently written to avoid Roe v. Wade. It creates a situation where they cannot sue the state because it isn't the state that is enforcing the law. As you mentioned, it is citizens that are enforcing the law. And as I understand it, the current court opinion is you can't really enforce that law that is never going to directly affect you. I can't stop someone else from stopping a third party from having an abortion because that doesn't affect me. And as a debate coach, we talk a lot about how laws are written to get around known prohibitions, how regulations are frequently built in order to enable prohibitions to be retracted or expanded depending on what the priorities are. I think you're right. It doesn't have an immediate effect beyond the state of Texas, beside the fact that it definitely says SCOTUS will sit on its hands with one of the most important and often assailed Supreme Court decisions in recent memory. Roe v. Wade is access to a fundamental form of health care for women all over the country. It impacts, women of color disproportionately. It has a massive impact on lower income women, obviously, in ways that are very clear and easy to prove. And when we say that it's only, kind of limited to Texas because it's a Texas law, we neglect the fact that, like what we're about to talk about, the voter suppression laws coming out of Texas as well. These are all products of legislation crafted by the American Legislative Exchange Commission, known as ALEC, and they're built to be a playbook. And when they get success in one state, that playbook is replicated across the country. So, thankfully, I think that there are bigger bulwarks in states like California, but there are other states, I think of my home state of Montana and other small states, that could see very, very similar legislation being passed at the state level and being ignored by the Supreme Court because of the very strategic way that it was written to get around a fairly explicit limitation on the access of rights to healthcare.
Yeah, the universal standing is ridiculous. I mean, I don't even know if there's any other law that has that. I mean, not even civil rights laws. You got to be affected, right?
I was able to find a professor from the Florida International University in Miami, Howard Wasserman, being interviewed, and he says that some statutes have authorized private citizens to sue to enforce a law even when they themselves are not harmed. What is different about the Texas law, he writes, is that the private enforcement is not in support of state law. It is in lieu of it. Mm-hmm. There is not the existing state law. It is the citizen that is the law. The citizen sees the violation, reports the violation, as you say, can get a bounty from it. It can affect the driver that took them to the airport. People are wondering if it affects Delta Airlines if they fly a woman out of state to get an abortion. Right. I mean, it insulates itself from regulation and from Supreme Court intervening really effectively and just strategically. It's kind of a masterpiece in terms of how it worked out.
And there's a women's clinic. I think they have 4 clinics. They're saying that they're not going to be able to offer abortions, period, regardless of the 6-week window. They're just saying they're going to have to shut it down.
Reports all over Texas of women being turned away because the care providers just cannot risk criminal activity. It's a chilling effect that they're after, and they're definitely getting it and they're seeing it. And we've seen these suppression tactics take real effect all over the country even before this. I will say the one ray of sunshine I have seen is that there are several groups, activist groups and other groups, that are spamming these report lines. They're just sending in so many just frivolous, absurd, and in many cases very obscene reports meant to just fill it with noise and make it very, very hard to enforce it. This is not going to go quietly. This is definitely not over, but it is just a catastrophic loss for everyone, and I think a very terrifying development for women and girls across the country.
I agree too. I mean, it probably is going to be overturned and repealed in Texas because it is becoming more blue as as we go along, and there will at some point. We've been talking on the show about when Texas will flip in terms of Democratic majorities and the rest, and it's going to happen. And I predict that this particular law will be repealed in the decade, but we've got the precedent. We've got the precedent of SCOTUS just letting it slide in a decision, and of course that in a decision that they don't even have to put their names to. They've got their plausible deniability. Well, we just didn't have time, or it wasn't the most important case on our docket, or whatever. And this is something that Justice Roberts, supposedly the moderate, has allowed. He has allowed them to do this. There's a lack of transparency in terms of these decisions that aren't being done in open hearings and the rest, and so they aren't as accountable. I mean, it's really bad. It's going to affect a lot of other issues as well, and that's probably going to happen for decades unless some of them die.
It leaves a huge legacy. Many of these clinics, they don't just come from nowhere. You have to attract providers, you have to set the thing up, and when they have to shutter overnight, it can take a very long time just to get an existing clinic back up and running, let alone replacing it with something that serves the community that was there before. So even in the interim, it's really, really disastrous. And it speaks to the real crisis that people spoke to when the Supreme Court was stolen, when Kavanaugh, replaced Kennedy, or we should say Merrick Garland, and when Amy Coney Barrett replaced Ruth Bader Ginsburg. A lot of people were saying this was one of the most catastrophic things to happen in this nation's history. It is one of the biggest political coups that we have seen, and a huge portion of folks in the middle and on the right said that that was hyperbolic. And I think now we're starting to see a very explicit example of what we were afraid of. Their names are etched on this in silence, and history will not forget it. But you're right; it's very convenient for them.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that this is going to galvanize people on the one side. So, even though it's not an explicit, I don't think it's going to work for them, because I think there is going to be a narrative out there. All right, we need to move on to the next topic. Okay, on this show, we've been discussing masks and vaccination battles. We're going to go back to the mask battle a little bit, because it has just intensified. DeSantis is actually not only trying to deprive funds of the districts who are basically rebelling against him, saying we're not going to send our kids into that mess, sorry, and is actually cutting off the salaries of the administrators who are doing this, and the administrators aren't backing down to their credit. There'll probably be fundraisers for them, and the rest. And DeSantis was actually possibly in violation of a court order that told him, no, you can't do that. You can't cut off funding, especially not federal funding. That's not your money to even cut off. You don't have discretion on that. And apparently Biden has actually said he's going to provide some help to those districts. I don't know what he can do if there's discretionary money that he can pour into them. It's certainly a political winner for him, because also in Florida, the death rates and the infection rates are soaring. The death rates aren't as high as they were last year, because we're better at treating it, and the vaccines, a lot of people who have the vaccines are getting sick, but they're able to survive it. But the infection rate is through the roof, especially down in the South, in Florida. Mississippi governor is trying to blame everybody but himself, and of course in Texas, the battle is still raging, and you've got a similar thing going there, where the governor's just obsessed with forcing districts to allow parents to have their kids come to school without masks.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating one, where the politics of it has to work out on some level, because you see all sorts of rifts within the Republicans themselves. Within Florida itself, the Leon County School District superintendent, who is a known Trump supporter, a big fan of DeSantis, sent a letter saying that the mask mandate is like the wrong course of action. That when it comes to like following data and the information that we have, the science that we have, it's all very one-sided. Masks make a difference. They limit the amount of people that go to our already overstressed hospitals. As I said on this show last time, the American healthcare system is not built based on demand or need. It's built based on profitability, and that works on a logic of scarcity. And so that means that we are already operating with too few of the very basic necessities and preventive care capacities for something like a pandemic. And then you exacerbate that by having politicians that are refusing to allow schools to follow the evidence and to protect themselves. You see in Oregon, an individual, a superintendent in the school, the state of Oregon, has been fired for enforcing the governor's ban. Here you have the school board firing the superintendent for following the rule that the governor set out to make these masks required, to help cut down on the transmission and cut down on the number of people that end up flooding into our hospitals and overcrowding it. I don't know where the payoff is. I know that big government and I think back to like Jade Helm and all of the conspiracy theories that we dealt with under the Obama administration. It's always been kind of on brand for a portion of the Republican Party to do this. But this one is so straightforward. The evidence is just overwhelming, and we're seeing cracks top to bottom. So it'll be interesting to see how much longer this continues.
I don't know, but they just don't seem to be backing down. They seem to be doubling down, as if that base. Now, this, I think, plays into the whole dynamics of the politics for the past few years. There's a huge overlap between the people who just feel that masks are the bane of our freedom, and I mean, even locally here, we have people putting on Jewish stars, like comparing it to Nazism because they might have to wear a mask when they walk into a store. I mean, it's over the top. But they must be basing the calculation on something. And I think one of the problems that the Republicans have had is I think that privately, a lot of these figures would love to tell the base to go pound sand and tell Trump that, but they can't. They can't win. They'll either be primaried or they just won't get the turnouts to be able to win the general election. So they're kind of stuck with it, but they've created this, and they created this situation. It actually predates Trump. I think it goes back to the Tea Party at least of 10 years ago of this bizarre kind of populism and reductionism in thinking. And yeah, they've just made masks their cause, and that's their whole thing. So much that we'll talk about it a little bit later with the recall here, but Larry Elder may have messed up his chances, according to some, by pushing that issue here in a state where that's not very popular. So it's just even if the governor isn't popular. So it's across the way. But again, you've got this Texas governor, Florida governor pushing it, not the Alabama governor, to her credit. She wishes, and I think the Arkansas governor even said he wishes he didn't sign the anti-mask bill. But with people dying, and I'm surprised that the Republicans aren't worried because it's mostly their supporters who are dying.
And it's a very basic thing for, like, the Biden administration is not really going to wow a lot of people with charisma and big accomplishments. Like, that's definitely not who they're going to be. But what they're doing is they're telling, like, schools in Florida that if they get their funding cut because they are requiring masks to stop a deadly pandemic, like, that's a win for them. And they're getting that. And it's just being handed to them. And I think that on the one hand, the calculation has to be, and I think we saw this with the Tea Party, we're not really so much for anyone as we are against the government and against whoever the Democrats are. And I think that that's a big part of this. It doesn't necessarily have to be popular for the candidate themselves, although I think you're right about the metric in terms of Trumpism and their base and their fear of being primaried. I think a big part of it really is just continuing to stoke that fear of big government, continuing to push for, what Luntz says, a government small enough to drown in a bathtub. And, again, if that's what you want, that's what you get. And a small thing topples a once mighty nation because the government just cannot even enact something as basic as a mask mandate.
It is. It is basic science, basic common sense. You don't need to be science. It fits into common sense since it's actually spread through our saliva. Even if only part of the saliva is caught, that's that much less volume in the air. I mean, it's not complicated stuff. This is not
and there's no risk. There's absolutely no evidence that says it exacerbates your asthma. There's absolutely no evidence that says that we are emotionally harmed. Like, I study facial perceptions and nonverbal communication for a living, and I'm definitely interested in the way that affects how we communicate. It's harder for people who can't read lips unless we wear transparent masks, but that's about as bad as we can find. It massively outweighs itself. Like, you may not think you're going to end up in the hospital, but if you do end up in the hospital and you have nowhere to go because the COVID numbers have just absolutely slammed your rural facilities, that's the consequence for this, and you don't see it until you're in the middle of it.
And I get into debates because I go onto conservative forums online and the rest, and I get into discussions with it. And when you point out the fact, because one of the things is, it's a face diaper, you're showing your fear. The primary point of the mask is actually more to protect others from you than you from the others. It's much more effective in that. And so it's like, how about just consideration for other people? I even said, even if it didn't have that effect, I wouldn't want to, if people are afraid of me without a mask, why do I want to inspire that kind of fear? It's just, anyway, it's ridiculous politics. Historians are going to look back on this. Of course, we did have anti-mask. There were anti-mask societies 100 years ago with the Spanish flu too. We have, this concept of freedom, where you shouldn't tell me what to do, but we're real selective about that, right?
With guns, it's exactly the opposite. With guns, we're going to carry a deadly weapon that risks the safety of everyone around us for the sake of being the hero and being the protector. And even though the evidence there says that doesn't work, they justify that as like a personal liberty and being the big, strong, like responsible person. But when it comes to just putting a mask over your face, this is apparently too far. It's too much. It doesn't have any effect. Again, the evidence is just very one-sided. It makes the argument pretty tedious.
It's kind of funny, too, because there was a woman who was anti-mask. All right, we need to move on. But real quickly, she was talking about how she's not going to wear a mask because God didn't make her face that way. She's wearing glasses. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health.
I go to bed at night thinking about the families that have lost loved ones over there, and in addition, the Americans we left, the allies we abandoned.
U.S. service members in Kabul did heroic work, securing the airport, protecting civilians of many nationalities, including tens of thousands of Afghans, and airlifting them out. We've seen pictures of U.S. service members at the Kabul airport cradling babies, comforting families.
We now have Americans stuck in Afghanistan, the Taliban in charge, with more weaponry than they've ever had in the past.
Okay, voter suppression in Texas. We're talking about Texas a lot today. Again, Texas is going to be a focal battleground state. It is becoming more purple, actually more blue with every election. Some of this stuff may actually galvanize the opposition. We'll see, but. They finally passed the bill that they'd been pushing to pass. The Democrats had found different ways to at least slow down to make their point. At one point, they left for Washington. There were threats to arrest them and the rest. They trickled back in, and eventually these laws got passed, and they include things like banning the overnight voting that some of the people were offering, drive-by voting, and the rest. Stuff that in California we're taking for granted. We go put the thing in the drop box. We're actually allowed to harvest votes, as they call it. It's because as long as it's somebody putting their name on the thing, it really shouldn't matter as long as there isn't fraud. But they are doing, I don't know if the law specifies one drop box per county, no matter how populated your county was, which was the order for the last election, which was really a problem for Dallas and Houston and Austin, which is, guess how they tend to vote as opposed to the rest of the state. So it has passed. In the past, these types of laws would have drawn some scrutiny from the federal government but unfortunately the Supreme Court gutted this several years ago, it'll be real curious. They wouldn't be able to pass it unless they could show there wasn't an irrational or unnecessary discrepancy in terms of its impact on different populations. This is clearly, whether or not it has racist or political intent, this law will clearly lower the voting in the progressive urban areas and maybe slow down that takeover we've been talking about.
Yeah, again, I mentioned it at the top of the show. This is another really good example of where the American Legislative Exchange Commission has been at work on this exact issue for a very, very long time, bringing together lawmakers from all over the country and just kind of workshopping ways to get something like this passed. According to the New York Times, including Texas, 18 states across the country have passed more than 30 bills this year restricting voting. This is one of the greatest contractions of access to ballots since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Democrats have very little hope of any kind of federal response. They were talking about, a voting bill at the federal level, but that's pretty much stalled. Republicans have cited voting fraud as the justification, but they are absolutely unable to produce any credible evidence of previous fraud taking place or that these specific laws that they're passing would target any fraud if it did take place. Even if they could prove illegal activity, they can't prove that these laws would have a consequence on that illegal activity, which is 2 strikes for a law that targets our ability to vote. As you mentioned, it limits drive-through polling, 24-hour voting, temporary voting locations. The law bans election officials from sending unsolicited absentee ballots out, from promoting the use of vote by mail. The bill empowers partisan poll watchers, which we have to spend a little bit of time talking about, creates new criminal and civic penalties for poll workers, and sets up new barriers for those looking to help voters who need assistance with things like translation. It requires large Texas counties, which Democrats perform better in, to provide live streaming video of all ballot counting locations, setting up future challenges to potentially fabricated stolen elections. It just creates all sorts of inroads to attack the vote. And there's a lot of evidence, as you say, that this has racial consequence regardless of the intention. Poll watching in particular is a very good example. In the United States, while poll watchers are not technically allowed to talk to election staff or voters, in the past they have always done both. The prohibition of this has been delayed, if it has even been enforced. And as a result, poll watching is used predominantly by white populations to intimidate, to harass voters of color, people that they don't think belong here or that should be voting. This is going to boil down along ethnic and racial lines. Historically, it always has. And this chills voting among communities of color. We can prove that. We can show that.
Yeah, the hope is for the Democrats is, again, this is a galvanizing force that they'll organize like they did during the civil rights movement to bus people there, to really get people there, kind of like what happened in Georgia this last time around. And we'll see that. And again, we'll probably see this law be repealed at a certain point, but they are just digging their heels in, hoping to hold on for as long as they possibly can. And this will help them do that. It might give them 1 or 2 more elections, but the writing is on the wall, and they really need to. Giving the Republicans who passed this thing the absolute best benefit of the doubt I can, it still doesn't make sense because it's seeking to fix a problem. It's a solution looking for a problem. I mean, they had this commission that Trump put up to find voter fraud. They found like 15 cases, and most of them were Republicans, by the way. And then all of a sudden that was mysteriously dissolved with no public record or anything of what they did. In Texas, they have found like 2 or 3 people that they're trying to nail to the wall to show that they're serious about voter fraud, but there just isn't evidence that it happened. And when you think about it, the crime, the penalty for it is so harsh, including never being able to vote again. Why would you chance it for 1 vote? It doesn't, why would you take that chance to accomplish it for a vote? How many elections have been won by 1 vote? Maybe 3 in our history, local elections. I mean,
it would have to be systematic. That's the other thing. The risk is huge. And it's not enough to get 10, 20, 30, 40 ballots across the line. You got to find a way to get hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands in close elections, hundreds of thousands of votes in major places like Los Angeles or, places like that. It can be a huge margin, and it as you say, it's a solution looking for a problem. I think the problem is that Democrats are winning, and I hope you're right that it's short-lived. I think that they've secured really surprising permanent minorities control in places like the Senate, at the White House level. Like they're pretty successful at hanging on.
Well, they're structured. The Senate is structured around it benefits conservative white people and rural people. It's a complete, maybe it had some point way back in the revolutionary times or the colonial times after that. Although I think it was to preserve slavery. Basically, it was pushed by it. But it's the Senate itself is an undemocratic process, and it's the only way.
College too.
The Electoral College as well. I mean, the Republicans have come short on votes in 6 of the last 7 elections, and it's so they're finding ways to avoid it. But you have a growing, and this is why they're so anti-immigrant. You have a growing, particularly Latino population. That's one of the big differences in the voting, and it made a big difference in getting Obama elected, and so they're freaking out about it. And rather than trying to win over Latinos, many of whom are culturally very conservative, they could probably do it if they didn't push things. The only reason I think the Latino vote in California is so anti-Republican is Prop 187. I don't think they would be able to take a majority of votes of color at any time soon, but they could certainly cut into it. But that's not their strategy. Their strategy is to try to shut it down, lock the border, and suppress the vote. I mean, it is, and they can only do it for so long.
The law and order rhetoric of all of those efforts dovetail really well with the conservatism that you're talking about within these groups. And I think that with so many of them saying that they came here the right way and that they believe in doing it the right way, that language translates very directly to voting, that voting should be done the right way. And they talk about it as though they're like defending America from some kind of major assault. But as with immigration, like what Donald Trump was calling like this like caravan or whatever they were calling it, like it's just total hyperbole. And if you actually go to the public policy experts or you go to the election experts, they're going to say this is the percentage of fraud you're going to have in every election. And what we saw was within that standard deviation or the margin of error. So it was an unremarkable election from the standpoint of security. And as the New York Times says, there are 18 states passing 30 different laws that are limiting our electing abilities as a result of that. Something's fishy.
Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause, the cause of democracy.
We are going to raise issues that, historically have not been raised.
What about the nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster? I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised.
All of this is possible for America. Who was standing in the way? Mitch McConnell.
Where an insurrection that sought to overturn an election, when that failed, the action moved into state capitals.
Our final topic for the night is an update on the recall. I think for a little over a week, or I'm not sure, maybe it's been 2 weeks, but the ballots, everybody has, since I think it's August 16th, everybody was sent a ballot that is registered to vote. They in their homes right now. A lot of them are being returned at as of this afternoon. Political Data Incorporated, they track this kind of stuff, and they're reporting that about 21% of the votes have been returned. That's indicating a high turnout in the long run. It's looking good for Democrats so far. But I want to qualify that in a minute, but they've got about 24% of their vote in, and the Republicans only have about, I think it's like 20 or 21% of their vote in. And of course, there are like about twice as many Democrats as there are Republicans. Independents are lagging behind, even though they're the biggest group. They have the least interest in this, at least so far. Caution, because as of late, it used to be conservatives who made use of absentee ballots, but these days, because of all the ideology and the conspiracy theories, Republicans, as part of their identity, almost say, I prefer to vote on election day. So there will be a big rush of those votes, but it is looking pretty good for Newsom to fight that off. And 3 polls have come in since the voting started. There was a lot of concern because some polls were within the margin of error, all had the no vote ahead. There was one survey Survey USA poll that had the yes vote ahead by 9 points, but they've acknowledged that that was an outlier, and they actually adjusted the way they asked the question to as terms of who is a likely voter, and they're on the other side of it now. They have the no vote 8 points ahead. Change Research and even Trafalgar, a Republican hack polling institute, as far as I'm concerned, has the no vote about 7 points ahead. So it's probably going down, but there are a couple of items of concern. When you go to that Political Data Institute site, you'll notice that white people have gotten something like 25% of their votes, and actually higher, possibly even higher than that. And African Americans and Asian Americans about 20%, Latinos only about 13%. There's definitely an enthusiasm gap there, and there's obviously going to be a lot of outreach to them, and that's a concern because white voters are about evenly split as to whether or not they support yes or no. Latinos oppose it by about 60%. Now and Asians, of course, oppose it by about 55%. I imagine with the African American vote, it's a lot like most elections where they probably oppose it by 80 to 90%. But it's but again, there aren't as many African American voters in this state as there are Latino and Asian. Asians are getting their votes back at about the same rate, but Latinos are lagging behind. And did the governor mess up in Los Angeles, or not even blaming the governor, but with the Delta variant and those communities being hit hard, slowest to get them vaccinated, although there were some pretty good campaigns to get them vaccinated. Maybe there's a little bit more vaccination skepticism in the communities because of a lot of history, maybe, but for whatever reason, they're not getting out to vote. Also, possibly because it's kind of confusing to a lot of people, as to what you're voting and how you're voting. And if there's any kind of a language issue, that might be a factor. So Democrats really have to work hard to get that out, because they need the votes of color out there. If they do that, it won't even be close if they can get them out.
The LA Times had what I thought was a really interesting comparison between the rhetoric that the Newsom campaign is doing to preserve his governorship and the language used by Scott Walker to survive his recall in Wisconsin, if you'll remember. It has a lot to do with the way that Newsom is framing it as like a Republican takeover, as Republicans trying to take away a duly elected governor. And he seems to be having quite a bit of success with that message. One of the polls that everyone's watching the polls right now, right? We all just love these polls right now when this recall's coming down the pipe. One of the ones that I was watching was talking about how 84% of Republicans surveyed and 62% of Democrats surveyed said that they plan to vote. And the same source is now saying 83% of the Republicans that have planned to vote have sent in their ballots, and 81% of Democrats that have planned to vote. And that's a big bump for the Democrats to see that we were worried about turnout. The early margins were based almost exclusively on whether or not the Democrats would be able to get the turnout necessary during a confusing and middle of the non-election season ballot drive going on. And I think that message has resonated. I think that it is an interesting comment on the Stop the Steal rhetoric that we're getting from the whole January 6th incursion and everything like that. In debate, we would call it a link turn, just flipping that argument right back and sending it the other way. And I do think that it's working. And I think the only other big note that I make here is that, California's recall system is fairly unique. As someone who moved to this state nearly 10 years ago now, I was pretty shocked at how frequently governors are facing these kinds of recalls. Yeah. I do remember when Schwarzenegger came to power with the recall of Gray Davis, but he had 48% of the vote at that time. Elder, who's the current leader, has 28% of the vote. And
the highest poll.
Yeah, and the court ruling recently that was challenging this says that, we don't like to admit it, but this is democratic. If we repeal someone like Newsom and say that, by 50% majority they're not fit to stand or to serve, then someone with a 27% majority can win. Democracy is not always about who has, the 50%. Right. It's about a plurality in certain circumstances. And as we've noted, it protects the minority in a lot of ways. The Senate does this, the Electoral College does this. This recall mechanism is kind of by design to do that. The margin is much closer than the candidate would allow. I think that's what's really remarkable, is that even with nobody running, they could potentially get rid of a governor. So that's fascinating.
I mean, I want to dedicate a show at a certain point to reforming the recall, because I do believe that it should be an option. But two things would probably shut down a lot of the partisan recalls. One is if you had a recall, the lieutenant governor became governor. That's what the lieutenant governor is elected for. They don't do much else, right? So that there wouldn't be as much of a motive, political motive, to be able to take over as a Republican if you're just going to be sending another Democrat into office, or vice versa. So that's one thing. But also, it's long been my opinion in this state, it's too easy to pass a recall and too easy to pass a constitutional amendment. It really should be 55%. I mean, not 60, that's a lot, but 55%, a solid majority. But I do think that Larry Elder, as I mentioned earlier in the show, also gave Newsom a break, because he's really been pushing about how he's going to repeal all the vaccine and mask mandates when he comes in. Well, with the Delta variant and the rise in infections really freaking a lot of people out, that's probably not the message that most urban people want to hear. It'll make them cheer in places like Fresno and Redding, maybe, but it's not going to. It will galvanize people to say, no, we can't do this. And the fact of the matter is, and what might also be saving Newsom, is the fact that everybody gets sent it. If they actually had to drag people out of their houses and get them to the polls, the enthusiasm gap might have made a big difference. But I'm not even sure there is an enthusiasm gap right now.
It's a good example of where that mail-in ballots and where, like absentee ballots and all the different mechanisms that we have to secure voting in California make a difference. And I guess that's a bad thing if your candidate loses, but generally we're supposed to think that's a good thing for democracy overall. Personally, I think that the way that California goes about citizen-run initiatives and referendums is itself just incredibly fascinating. It's such a massive state, from, the referendums to Prop 8. There's just such a complex history in terms of the things that the state has gone after. Prop 22 is another really good example. So we think of California as this liberal state, but this system has really given a lot of conservative voices really tremendous power to enact their will if they can't get it done at the regular ballot box. It's fascinating. I'm also in support of it. I definitely agree, though, that the lieutenant governor should take over. Like, it doesn't make any sense to recall Joe Biden and have shoehead guy become president of the United States because he got the most votes in the recall effort. It would be the vice president. That's what that position's for.
Okay, well, we'll be talking a lot more about that in future shows, but that takes us to our last segment. All right, predictions. What have you got for us?
Well, I hope I'm wrong about this, but my prediction is that the Democrat progressives are going to blink before Nancy Pelosi does. Pelosi says she's going to hold out for their $3 trillion budget surplus to get college for people and all of this other stuff. I don't think she's going to do that. I think they're going to be stuck with the button of whether or not they pass the infrastructure bill or not, and the progressives are going to vote to pass it, and we're not going to see many of the big things they're hoping for.
We'll see. We could discuss that forever. Well, I've got two predictions. One is Ron Johnson just got caught on camera. It was a secret camera. Somebody who was taping him, what's his name, James O'Keefe type thing, only this woman's a left-winger. I don't really approve of that kind of gotcha thing, but caught him online basically admitting that the big lie is a big lie, saying, well, Trump lost because there are about 50,000 50,000 voters who didn't vote for him, and we know this because all the other candidates combined received 50,000 more than he did in the state. He's probably worried about that for his reelection. My prediction is after that, he's probably going to be forced to drop his reelection bid. Secondly, I've said this, and I actually think this is an extension of my prediction of last week. I think that the recall is not only going to go down, but down by 10 points or more. I think that a lot of this was a media hype created by problems with their own polling as to how they asked for the questions. But I don't think that Newsom was ever in danger of losing that. I may eat those words hard, things could happen, but I really think it's going to go down in flames.
Is he a presidential candidate if he survives? Yes or no? What do you think?
Yes.
I think so too. I think so too.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Aaron. We will invite you back definitely for another show. I want to again thank all the people producing this, Matt, and well, I will until next time. Keep thinking.